Hi everyone, my name is Josh Tompkin, and I'll be presenting to you today about the inclusion of characters with disabilities in young adult literature. Before I begin, I'd like to briefly explain why I chose this topic. Having a background in K-12 education, as well as a wife who teaches special education, I encounter students daily who have various disabilities. Each and every one of these students are very near and dear to my heart. Recently, I have noticed an increase in the discussion of books related to characters with disabilities. This made me want to look into not only the books themselves, but how we can use these books to teach awareness and acceptance of those with disabilities. Next is the evolution of literature featuring characters with disabilities. Prior literature either had no mention of characters with disabilities, or if they did, those with disabilities were often secondary characters. These characters would often get in the way of or be a burden on the protagonist. An example of this would be Lenny in John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. Lenny is portrayed as a burden to the protagonist George, who is required to take care of him. If you've read the book, you know how it ends. It ends because of Lenny's actions. Current literature, however, is different. Michelle Blank, in her article titled People First, Disabilities in Young Adult Literature, asks, how has the world of young adult literature presented the perspectives of those with disabilities? Why, with humor, compassion, and a realism that reminds the reader that these are people first who just happen to have a disability. We see much more inclusion of characters, especially protagonists, with various disabilities. We see them thrive in spite of or as a result of their disability. One example of this would be Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson and the Olympians series, in which main character Percy Jackson manages to go on epic adventures despite his dyslexia and ADHD. His disabilities actually help him in the series, completing tasks such as reading Greek. When analyzing young adult literature dealing with characters with disabilities, we must consider the impact on those students with disabilities as well as on those without disabilities. Karen Campbell states in her article, Selecting Children's Books About People with Disabilities, that all children like to see some part of themselves in literature. By creating more works with characters with disabilities, we can show those students characters that they can closely relate to. On the other hand, by introducing inclusive literature to students who do not have disabilities, they can gain a better understanding of and respect for their peers who might have disabilities. In Sharon Andrews' article titled Using Inclusion Literature to Promote Positive Attitudes Towards Disabilities, she argues that increased sensitivity and awareness is one result of students reading inclusive literature. She also provides evidence to back up this claim. In similar articles, other researchers make the same claims. Emily Wapperer states that literature portraying characters with disabilities can help children and young adults develop the habit of reading for pleasure about characters like themselves, and it can support the development of personal power by portraying these characters as strong and believable. Carly O'Kyle states in her article, Disabled Characters in Young Adult Literature, that reading and carrying literature in libraries that have characters with disabilities is something librarians can initiate as part of an effort to bring attention to the disabled community, as well as spread awareness among those who might not have any disabilities. They've all found that inclusive literature is a positive for both those with and those without disabilities. Of course, by now, I hope you're on board with teaching inclusive literature. But how does one do it? We can simply incorporate the usual pedagogical strategies here. First, however, we must break students of the habit of viewing things as normal or abnormal. Once we do this, then we can dive into the various disabilities and literature. Students can be asked to take a critical look at a situation in a book, an in-depth look at a character, or even do some background research on the specific disability or disabilities mentioned in the book of choice. Students can put themselves in that character's shoes, so to speak. The teacher can even encourage class discussions or debates related to the literature they are reading. For students in the lower adolescent grades, perhaps they can write a letter to the main character of a book. We don't need to go about teaching inclusive literature much differently than other critical analysis assignments. As Jacob Stratman states in his work, Lessons in Disability, Essays on Teaching with Young Adult Literature, Stratman encourages the use of book talks, but for students and by the students themselves to truly get them immersed in what they're reading. If you find yourself struggling with instructional strategies on how to teach inclusive literature, I would recommend the Stratman book and giving it a read. I have seen the previous methods I talked about used to teach Wonder, which is currently a very popular book that was just made into a movie, about a boy with a facial deformity due to Treacher-Collins syndrome. We must be sure to portray these characters not as abnormal or normal, but as characters who may or may not be different than we are. We can then go from there and dive into the world of inclusive young adult literature. By now I've mentioned some examples in passing of great inclusive literature, but I want to give you a more comprehensive list. First and foremost, one should check the list of Schneider Family Book Award winners. The Schneider Family Book Award honors an author or illustrator for a book that embodies an artistic expression of the disability experience for child and adolescent audiences. One can check Mackin or do a simple Google search for the award, and it will bring you a list of books that have won the award in the past. Some other recommended titles include Turtles All the Way Down by John Green, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie, Al Capone Does My Shirts by Jennifer Choldenko, Percy Jackson and the Olympian Series by Rick Riordan, Wonder by R.J. Palacio, Fish in a Tree by Linda Mullally Hunt, Rain, Rain by Anne M. Martin, and The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. This is by no means a complete list of inclusive literature for young adults, so I encourage you to go out and research more books that fall under this category. I hope you found this conference inspiring, and I encourage you to use inclusive young adult literature featuring characters with disabilities in your own lessons. I thank you for listening.